welcome to this two-part series on modeling a cupcake here. This first part is going to be focused on getting the base models set up and retopologizing some stuff using geometry nodes to help with some of the modeling. And then the second part we're going to do is going to be focused on shading this stuff procedurally, setting up some textures for it, and rendering it out. So we're going to add a cylinder with 16 vertices here. In edit mode, just sort of start shaping the cake using just simple extrusions and scales. For the tops here, we don't want to have an end on there, so I'm going to delete that out. Just select the edge, and then in the F3 menu, use the grid fill tool. And this will sort of just fill the area with quads, which is much better for in terms of topology and displacement. Here I actually thought it was a bit too dense at the top, so I'm going to just drag these edges out and smash them into the sides there, and just spread out the rest a little bit more. Cool, but now we actually have duplicate vertices on the sides, so we're going to have to go into edit mode and merge by distance there to get rid of those duplicates. The bottom is less of a concern because we won't really see that, so I'm just going to inset it a couple times and then just use the merge at center function to make a sort of triangle fan. And here I just add some supporting loops just to control the subdivision surface a little bit better there. And then I'm going to use a bit of proportional editing just to tweak the shape a little bit more. So the next sort of step is, because this is an organic food, to add some natural displacement and imperfections to the model, because it's just perfectly smooth at the minute. So to do this, I'm going to use a displacement modifier with a clouds texture and tweak the scale of the texture to be something quite fine, and then just turn the strength way down. You could sort of play with the level of subdivisions, see what gives you the best result for your displacement, but I wouldn't recommend going too high at this stage. And then I'm just going to add a subdivision surface modifier after this, just to smooth out that displacement as well. So now for the actual cupcake paper, I think that's what it's called, I'm going to do procedurally in the geometry nodes editor here. You could do this manually, but I just thought it would be quite nice to explore how we might use geometry nodes for some traditional modeling. So you can basically add this geometry nodes on any old object. And then going into the editor there, we're going to add a curve star. And the reason we're going to use a star is because it closely resembles the actual geometry that we want for the cupcake holder, which is a sort of in and out movement. And as we tweak the radiuses here, you can see how that starts to take shape. So essentially what we want to do with this is take this and extrude it up, kind of, but instead of doing that quite destructively, we want to be able to control the profile of it and the scale of it at each point. So what we're going to do is actually use a curved line and then use this as the profile curve, converting that to a mesh, and then we'll be able to control the radius at each point along the curve. So you'll see what I mean. So if we set the radius to 1 here, you can see we just get this sort of cylinder. But now what we can actually do is control the radius using a color ramp and sort of make it so that it tapers from the bottom towards the top. So to do this, we're going to use a spline factor. And what this is basically just a value of 0 to 1 along our straight line curve there. So the radius is now 0 at the bottom and 1 at the top. You can use a color ramp and sort of tweak the value there to be not 0. We can sort of bring it in a bit, make it not quite 1. And now what we want to do is add some tapering, so I'm going to resample this curve. And you can see what that does is essentially add those cuts in between, which gives us enough geometry to sort of play with, to taper it inwards, or essentially do whatever we want to with it. So now we can add another stop in the color ramp and sort of play with how we want to taper that. It's also quite linear at the minute, so you may want to change the actual interpolation mode of the color ramp from linear to to something else. I found B-spline works quite nicely, but you can always have a little play with it. I think ease goes a bit too in and out. We can sort of tweak the height if we want to. We can come back and change all this later. Yeah, and I think less points as well matches the reference a bit better. But yeah, that's essentially the basics of it. What I'm doing now is just going to change the actual spline type from a polycurve where you have that very straight linear motion to a NURBS, which gives us a really nice sort of naturally smooth look without having to add any subdivisions. Yeah, we can sort of tweak the radiuses and the amount of geometry we're generating here. It's quite dense at the minute, so I'm just going to see if we can resample this to be something a little more reasonable. A fair bit more than the actual number of curve points we have. Okay, I'm just going to add some displacement within geometry nodes at the end here. To do that, it's really easy. You just add a set position with a noise texture. A couple vector math nodes we need. We need to subtract 0.5 so it doesn't all offset. Then we just play with the scale a little bit here. And then we add a vector math scale node to sort of control the strength of the noise. So we want to set that fairly low, keep it pretty subtle, but as you can see it adds a little bit of distortion, makes it feel a little bit more natural. Alright, so icing. The best way I found to do this is actually using curves. So we're going to add a Bezier curve here, which is essentially going to be the controller for where the icing is going to generate. And we're going to make a procedural system in geometry nodes to sort of generate the actual cross-section of the icing here. So first I'm just going to start shaping this to sort of roughly match what we want for icing. It's really useful to actually watch videos of people icing real cupcakes here to get some sort of an idea for, you know, what it really looks like and how they, the sort of paths they take when they really do it. Okay, so we're going to add some geometry nodes here, and the first thing we're going to do is add a curve to mesh node. And now in the profile curve, just like we did for the cupcake base, we're going to plug in a star, and there's all various kinds of icing you can get looking into this. But I think the best way for us would to have something around 5 points, I think. Because any more than that, when it comes to retopologizing, it's going to become a bit of a nightmare. But, you know, you can always play around and sort of decide how many points you want your icing to have there. I've also just set it to shade flat here as well, just because it was shading a bit weirdly. You can also use Control-T to twist the icing there, which is a really useful way of doing that, and it would be quite difficult to do that using traditional modeling, so it's really the power of this method. You can also use Alt-S on a handle to sort of scale the icing in or out. When you're happy with how your icing looks, the next step is to remesh it in a kind of way. And for this I'm just going to do it inside geometry nodes just to keep everything in one sort of modifier, but you could use the remesh modifier if you want to. But I found the easiest way to do it is to just convert the mesh to a volume and then convert it back to a mesh again. Yeah, and I spent quite a bit of time tweaking this again. Actually restarted the curve as well. And you may think that's going backwards, but I find sometimes when I can't get something to look right, restarting it from scratch is just sometimes the simplest solution. And you know, you always get it quicker the second or third time around. When you're happy with something, it's always worth just taking a look at it in rendered view. I'm using cycles here to take a look, just because you want to see how it occludes and the sort of You get a better sense. So, retopology. This is a very time-consuming and pretty laborious process, but it's quite important, really, for any sort of professional work, or even just getting clean UVs on something, and clean subdivisions. My process for retopology is sort of just starting with a plane, normally, and just taking this plane and shrink wrapping it to the object that we want to retopologize. You can't target the curve we have at the minute because it's currently a curve with all these geometry nodes on it. So first we have to apply the geometry nodes. So here I'm just using the F3 menu and using the visual geometry to mesh function, and that will just bake everything down essentially. It can be useful to make copies of these meshes before you apply modifiers and move them to a backup collection. That just gives you the flexibility to tweak stuff later down the line if you want to. And then I also add a subdivision surface modifier set to simple before the shrink wrapping occurs. And what this does is just sort of cheats a little bit of extra geometry in there for you for free. And that can be quite useful. So you have to add literally every vertex there. Turning on face snapping is quite useful. Setting the shrink wrap to above surface with a tiny offset lets you visualize it quite well. And then you just sort of start with this basic quad and just think about how you want your edges to flow around the object. And I'm using control right click here just to extrude quickly around the icing, because I know that for sure I'm going to want some quads like this following the flow of the icing, so I'm just going to start with what I know I'm going to want in the final mesh. The way I go about this is, instead of trying to do everything connected right from the beginning, I usually just add in some loops that I know I'm going to need, and then worry about connecting them towards the end. And usually it all sort of comes together fairly quickly. As long as you have in the back of your head that everything sort of roughly needs to have the same amount of loops at the end, it usually works pretty well. And if there's anywhere where I'm not 100% sure about, I usually leave it, come back to it later, and once I have more loops and more faces, it sort of reveals itself in a bit more of an obvious way what to do. So here I start looking at extruding out from the initial loops that I put in there, and starting to look at how I'm going to connect the two different loops together. I won't bore you with the entire process here, but essentially it is just going around repeating this process, trying to make sure that your edges flow, make sense with the geometry, that you're not creating any n-gons. Triangles are okay, but try and minimize them. Try and do quads where you can, and think about your edge flow. So when you add a loop cut, where do you want it to? How do you want it to wrap around the mesh? You don't sort of want things wrapping back in themselves and that kind of stuff. It can get a bit weird. But honestly, for the purposes here, I'm not going to worry too much about that if we do get a little bit of it at the end, because this is the purposes of retopologizing. This aren't to be rigged or anything like that. It's just mostly for UVs and shading and that kind of thing. So it's not as big of a deal. So here's sort of an example of one of the issues you might come into when retopologizing, where you're connecting those edge loops that you created earlier, is that you end up with this scenario where it looks like the only solution is to sort of add an end here or use triangles. But you know, you could actually just add another edge loop at the top here and then keep everything as quads and sort of spread those edges out at the top a bit more. So it's always worth just trying to think about how you could add edges or how you could merge certain edges together to reduce the amount of scenarios like this you come into. It's also advisable to try and keep everything as much quad based as possible, so if you minimize the amount of sort of rectangular shapes that you have, that's always ideal. And also trying to keep the level of detail across the mesh fairly consistent, so you're not ending up with areas where there's loads of edges or vertices converging. That's also quite important. But there's really no exact science to it. It's really just trying to think, if I were to model this from scratch, how might I actually model it? And you know, you typically use this process on sculptures or basically anything that's been remeshed or has messy topology. But you can see just how much more efficient the topology is than what it was before. And that will, you know, really help our memory usage, our performance. It will help us when we come to texture this and all that kind of stuff. So it's really useful, worth doing. But yeah, this whole process took me about an hour. So yeah, it's definitely time consuming. It's also important to make sure that you don't accidentally end up filling in faces inside the mesh here like I did accidentally earlier. So I just went through and in X-ray mode made sure to delete all those out. Coming towards the end of the process now, everything's pretty much filled out, so I'm going to Control A apply both these modifiers now, the subdivision and the shrink wrap. And then just isolate this and start looking at filling in the bottom here, really simply. Just taking the outer edge loop, extruding it in. I just use loop tools to make that a circle. Extruding it one more time and then just do the usual merge at center. So the only thing really left to do now is to shade, texture and light all of this and finish off the cupcake paper model. And we're going to do all this in a second part, so yeah, make sure you check that out.